Thank you very much, Noel, and thank you to the Institute of World Politics for their interest in this topic and for inviting us to be with you today. First off, I want to say Kalispera, which means good day. I'm currently in Greece on a small rock called Kassos, which is in the Dodecanese. It's between Crete and Rhodes. And it's a strategic location. They call it the protector of Crete back in the more battle-weary days. But we're delighted to be with you today because what we're talking about today is an issue that is pivotal to not only our nation's security, but global security. And that's really the impact of maritime and maritime security on every aspect of our lives. If I could have the next slide, Carlos. So most of you probably don't think about maritime until there's a container ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or perhaps one that hits a bridge in Baltimore. But when you think about the fact that the maritime industry delivers 90% of the world's goods and energy, and truly is the engine of global trade, maybe you'll start to think about those ships out there. It is the backbone of the nation's economy and security. It is the most environmentally benign and efficient mode of transporting bulk goods. And it is of vital importance to supporting our military efforts. Next slide. And let's take a look at how this is played out through history. Maritime truly is the underpinning of a nation's prosperity. Let's take a look back at Portugal. Portugal was a maritime power in the 15th and 16th centuries. But today, how about Spain? It too was a maritime power until the mid-17th century. And today, Great Britain, remember the phrase, Britannia rules the waves. But where is it today? China was a maritime power until 1421, when the emperor didn't like the external influences and he shut the country down for basically centuries. But there's been an incredible resurgence in the past 30 years, and a lot of it is based on its maritime sovereignty and maritime strength. Just to give you another perspective, at the end of World War II, 50% of the world's ocean-going tonnage was US flag. Today, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Carlos, thank you. Today, the percentage of US flag in ocean-going transportation is 0.4. Think about it, 180 vessels out of the 55,000 commercial ocean-going vessels, 0.4 carry the US flag. Next.
Carlene, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can. Hey, Jim.
It's Jim.
Welcome. Yeah. Welcome, Doc.
Yeah.
Do you want to
let me
we're
just
glad
jump
that you're
in.
able to join us.
I'd love to participate now that I've joined, and I do appreciate the Institute of World Politics kind introduction. So I worked with Carlene and a number of other colleagues to create the book that we're going to be talking about today. And one of the things I want to start adding is about today's international maritime world in a number of different categories. So it's in transition. The maritime is more transparent than it's ever been through history, largely because of the satellites and the communications and the information sharing that goes on with commerce that never really happened in the past. There's a huge amount of public interest. There's new routes. You've heard about the rerouting of ships around Africa due to the Red Sea issue. There's also issues regarding new fuels, as well as global conflict that is affecting maritime in other regions of the world. The maritime is a fully globalized industry, which means that there's lots of transnational corporations involved. Ships are owned, by nearly everybody in the world in terms of their nationalities and their crews and their registries. So these ships that sail the seas in support of our economy are not normally registered in the United States. As Carlene pointed out, only about 0.4% of them are. And then finally, I would suggest that the maritime is much more impactful than it's ever been due to the supply chain concerns that we learned about after COVID. We've also been hearing a lot about the port infrastructure that is affected greatly by the ships and the nations that own those ships. The corporations that own those ships are driving the port infrastructure in our own country. Trade currency is driven largely by the international trade that goes on ships, and the owner of those ships and the charterers. And then finally, has been the case for many, many years in history, shipping is critical to a nation's military, and I think that is particularly true today.
But there are a lot of changes going on in shipping, and right now the maritime industry is under extreme stress. For one thing, there's a seafarer shortage, and we're going to be talking about that a little more later on in the discussion. But globally, they're anticipating being 96,000 mariners short by 2026. And that shortage is even more powerful and profound in the United States. There are also the embattled seaways. I think probably all of you have been following what the Houthis have been doing in the Red Sea. Now they're claiming the Mediterranean, which has been disavowed, but preventing commercial shipping from transiting through the Red Sea and therefore the Suez Canal. So that has become a big challenge for shipping because now the ships have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And that increases the mileage, increases emissions, etc. We also have something since the Ukrainian war, and these sanctions have been placed on Russian transport of oil. We have what we call the dark fleet. What that is are substandard ship registries that are carrying Russian oil illegally. And generally, these vessels are dangerous, old, poorly operated, poorly crewed. And they are doing ship-to-ship transfers. It's highly dangerous, could result in a large environmental incident, if not further damage between ships. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got the Houthis attacking using drones and missiles. We've got new tools of warfare that are being directed at ships. One of the things that is changing rapidly, and this change is happening most profoundly in this decade, is how tech dependent this industry is and becoming. For instance, satellite communications. We've been using satellite technology for probably, I don't know, last 15 years or so, but it is universally adopted now. And that means that in some cases, you're talking about the shoreside staff saying exactly what's going on board the ship and vice versa. And the shoreside giving directions to the ship that previously they wouldn't have visibility on. That is changing. We've got AIS and GPS. AIS is the automated identification system, and GPS, of course, is global positioning system. We know where if they've got their transponders on, we know where ships are all the time. What's interesting is on my phone, I use marine traffic because wherever I go, I'm always looking at ships. And I can tell when a transponder isn't on because I can see a vessel, but I can't find it on marine traffic. So that's a way of tracking ships, It's also a way of spoofing ships. There's a lot of spoofing going on that is using, diverting it's interfering with the actual position of the ship and showing it as being in a different location. Sometimes that's being used strategically, sometimes it's being used dangerously. We've also got an increased amount of automation. A lot of the activities on board a vessel are being automated, some in ports, but in our country, we're resisting it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, too. And then, of course, there's artificial intelligence, which is both an enabler and a risk for all industries. But we are poised for change in terms of the industry. There is stronger governance of the industry. We're reducing our emissions, and there are more regulations coming into force with stronger goals. Right now, we've got a net zero by 2050 as a goal. There's more diversity, not as much as I'd like to see as a woman in this industry, but there is increased amount of diversity and also new business models. These are all changes that I've got to tell you how excited I am to be in this industry in this decade because everything's changing. Next slide.
So I'd like to jump in and talk a little bit about the regulatory context for the international maritime. As I mentioned, it's a very globalized industry, and it's characterized by having a major organization that's connected to the United Nations called the International Maritime Organization. Now, all the countries in the world, except a very small handful, are members of the International Maritime Organization. So that's because nearly every country, whether it has a ocean front or access to the sea or not, has a stake in international maritime. The IMO is a body that deliberates on safety, security, and the environment, the environmental impact on ships. There's another organization that they work closely with called the International Labor Organization that deals with the mariners themselves and a lot of the issues associated with those mariners' life at sea. Over the years, IMO has really become the organization that sets the standards, the world order for maritime. And that world order is not actually enforced by the IMO. It's enforced by national governments where the ships are coming and going from. And that's done by a set of standards referred to as port state control. So any nation that is receiving a ship from a foreign country with a foreign crew has the right under the IMO rules to make sure that that ship complies with these international standards that have been agreed upon by the flag states or the flag administration of the ships. So that's why every ship must be registered. If it's not, it's a pirate ship. It can't be a stateless ship and be a legal ship in the world order of maritime. Now, there are a lot of flag administrations that are actually open registries. This is the characteristic, I think, that has created the full globalization of the maritime, because you can be from a particular nation and register your ship in an open registry in a different nation, and then you can have crews that are made up of people from other nationalities that aren't either yours or where that ship is registered. And that system was created after World War II because it does the opposite of nationalism. It allows nearly anybody in the world to participate in a non-associated way as far as a connection to a national government and help drive the world economy. And it's been hugely successful. But as we're going to probably get into a little bit more in the future slides here, there are some concerns with how far this has gone for the world in regards to international maritime. Next slide. So this is actually one of the main concerns that we looked at as authors of 0.4. When we took a look at what the framework for maritime security should be in regards to the United States of America, we came upon this concept that it's way more than just military security. It's national security in a very broad way that it talks to our economic security because of the trade due to imports and exports, our energy and food security because of the magnitude of the use of ships for our daily energy and nutritional needs. Climate security, when we looked at where the world is going with regard to management of climate change, ships and the maritime are a critical element of that concern that the world has. 71% of the world's surface is ocean water. So you cannot ignore the international maritime. And finally, workforce security. There's a lot of concerns in the country today about our industrial workforce, and certainly you need a strong maritime to complement your industrial workforce in any country. So we crafted the discussion in our book about the everyday criticality of shipping. We talk about the strategic importance of maritime security in all those contexts and the implications for the changes that we were just talking about in maritime. And then, and very importantly, there's an opportunity cost, we believe, of inaction that will affect consumers and public well-being, our industry, our financial community, the government, and certainly careers of people who may not even understand that there is a great career in maritime. So our conclusion is that the American people should support the maritime industry. And if they don't, we think that will cause us to be a vulnerable nation. Next slide. So I'm going to just touch a little bit on our national security in regards to our U.S. flag fleet, which, as we mentioned, is only 0.4% of the world fleet, which is about 180 ships. About 100 of those ships are dedicated to our own domestic sea routes up and down our coast and to the remoter parts of our nation, such as the Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico routes, and Guam, those places that are obligated to have their supplies, their supply chain provided for by U.S. flagged ships. So one of the concerns that we have is that that only leaves about 80 ships that are in international use. So that those ships could support our national security. And in fact, they are getting funding from the US government on an annual basis to be ready to do just that. But those 80 ships are also in commercial service, and they would possibly have an impact on our economy were they to shift to a military service need, such as this tanker in the picture that's actually going to transfer its cargo over to a U.S. Navy gray hull oiler that services the combatant fleet, which is, of course, distributed around the world. Now, there are reserve ships which are not normally active, and they are becoming very, very old in terms of typical ship lives. The average age of our reserve fleet, and there's about 48 ships that are in this reserve fleet. They're anchored in different harbors in the world and used occasionally, but their average age is 46 years old. Typically, by the time a ship gets to be 25 or 30 years old, it's ready for the scrapyard. So we have a very old ready reserve fleet. That's what it's called, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's ready. And within that fleet, and also within the fleet of ships that are commercial ships ready to go to sea to the far ends of the world, there's very few tankers. Now, you can see in the picture that tankers are being used by the U.S. military every day. But in the event that our forces are deployed somewhere in the world, they're going to need a lot of fuel oil and lubricants. And the expectation, at least from Admiral James Fogo, as expressed in November 2022, was that you would need about 100 tankers. And we have now just 9 tankers in a newly established program that should grow dramatically, but seems to be a bit stalled, and that's one of our major concerns. Next slide. So I think I've sort of made the case that our military effectiveness does require commercial support. We can't depend on those old reserve ships, and we can't really depend on just the Navy itself. We must have that commercial support. In fact, 90% of military logistics actually depends on ships, not airplanes. And the more distance that you have and the more equipment that you want to carry on ships, the more commercial ships you're going to need. And this isn't something that would just be need after the crisis begins. This is something that actually deters crises. If you have a strong commercial presence around the world and you have a strong Navy and other armed forces that are appropriately distributed around the world, that's what's maintained world order and peace since World War II. So I mentioned the open registries. Now, open registries have been very good, for the world economy. They're very appreciated by the American consumers. But the question is, are these ships, the owners of ships in open registries, are they going to be able to support any need that the United States might have? And the answer is, well, history has shown that they're companies. They're not obligated to support. They have no commitment to the United States or any other country. And so, the jury would be out as to what would happen with those ships in a crisis when the United States might otherwise need them. So we do have, as I mentioned, a fleet of 80 ships that are in international trade, of which 71 of them are in a program that are committed to support the armed services of the United States. And I also mentioned we have the 48 ships in the Ready Reserve Force. But the bottom line here is the merchant mariners needed to actually operate both the reserve fleet and a high tempo use of those 71 ships were they to be called up for a crisis. 11,000 U.S. merchant mariners isn't going to do the job. First of all, those people are fully employed in peacetime. Obviously, if there's a crisis, that the op tempo and the reserve fleet would compete with the normal maritime profession that keeps our goods and services moving in everyday life. So where would you all of a sudden get unlimited merchant mariners, people that can actually sail a large commercial ship or tanker across the world? It's just a difficult challenge that we have right now. Next slide.
And that was one of the areas that we took a look at. And what we wanted to do was, well, what's the bench strength, if you will, of some of the other countries? And we did it within the context of mariners in countries supporting Putin's Ukraine war. In other words, supporting Russia. So you've got the direct support of Russia, and the number of mariners between Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, 208,000. Then there's the indirect, Syria and Iran, almost 18,000 mariners. China has 135,000 mariners. And India, frankly, India swings both ways. But when it comes to supporting Russia, India is pretty much with Russia. So that adds another 113,000. All of these are against the American 11,000 mariners. Next slide. And since China seems to be in the news a lot, and remember I said earlier, China had shut down in 1421, reopened, and in the last 30 years has grown tremendously in its maritime might. China is now the largest ship-owning nation in the world. It is the largest shipbuilder in the world. And it has the most commercial vessels with military capability. And what we mean by that is they're building commercial ships with military capabilities so they could be used either way. And so China, 9,658 ships between China and Hong Kong, and we have 180. Next slide.
So let me jump in and just talk about economic security for a second. Our trade, and obviously a major portion of our economy that moves by ships, has a dollar value on an annual basis of $1.8 trillion. I think a lot of people, realize that ships are going in and out of our ports with all of that dollar value, but I don't think it's something that they consider when they look at what can happen and what actually has happened in this maritime transportation system. You may remember after COVID, there was a supply chain crisis. Now, that wasn't entirely due to the ships. It was something that was impacted by the ports on either end of the supply chain. But what we do know is that it caused a certain amount of panic. It definitely caused inflation, which is still going on ever since then. Our government had to spend a huge amount of tax dollars to address that inflation and to the shortfalls that were observed and felt in that post-COVID supply chain crisis. Companies have moved to be nearer the United States, and actually foreign owners of ships and shipping companies had a huge windfall, a lot of which are owned and operated by China and other nationalized companies. So it's certainly fair to make the statement that we're vulnerable. Our ports are vulnerable. Shipping lanes, of course, are vulnerable right now in the Red Sea, the Black Sea. There's piracy that occurs in the Straits of Malacca as well as in the Gulf of Aden. Geopolitical upheaval definitely affects international trade that goes on largely on maritime assets. Cyber has become a very attractive tool for bad actors that want to disrupt the global economy. Labor is affected, and certainly accidents. One of the things that I think we're going to talk about a little bit, and it's on the next slide, is what we all witnessed just recently. Next slide, please. The Dolly accident in Baltimore. Now, this is a very large container ship. It's not nearly the largest, but much larger than was in trade when the bridge, the Francis Scott Bridge in Baltimore, was built, 40 years ago. So this is one example of an accident that may be partially due to the ports not necessarily keeping up adequately, despite a lot of spending by the United States and its ports. It's been very difficult to keep up with the size of ships as they are constantly being built to be bigger and bigger to lower the cost of moving these containers more efficiently. Now, Baltimore is also another example where those ready reserve ships that I mentioned, some of the 48 ships, 4 of them, in fact, were trapped when the bridge fell down. That's a port where we keep some of these ready reserve ships. One, very fortunately, got out just hours before the bridge went down due to the Dolly accident. That was just pure luck. But 4 were stuck in there until the channel could be cleared. And then there's the economic impact that would be typical, although probably slightly different for any particular port in the U.S. In the case of Baltimore, it's a major port for coal and for automobiles, both exports and imports, and that affects significantly the local economy as well as really the national economy, because our system is obviously optimized for intact ports, not for the adjustments that you have to make for an accident like that. And then the bridge will have to be rebuilt, which has a big impact to the people of Baltimore and to the other parts of their economy, but also is expensive at the cost of about 1.9 billion. Next slide.
So how does shipping impact economic security? I mean, right now we're going through a period, there's an evolving, I don't want to call it a trend yet, but there's an interest in changing the currency in which some shipping transactions are being made. So in other words, there's a threat to US dollar-denominated international trade, and maritime does have a significant influence over the currency of global trade. And the other thing to remember is we always think of the United States being the world leader in trade. Well, our share of global trade and influence over commercial shipping activities is obviously declining rapidly. There's a growing foreign influence over U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, such as foreign investors rather than local governments or companies controlling most of the maritime value chain. I will give you an example that years ago, China began a program called the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, where they invested in 115 ports around the world. They now own 67% of the port of Piraeus here in Greece. That means our military ships cannot go into Piraeus. That means that they have a significant voice in how that port is operated and whose cargo gets loaded and discharged in priority. And they've made a massive investment in the infrastructure, the global infrastructure for shipping. There have also been missed opportunities, about $6 trillion in the blue economy. There's been a lack of coordination and interest, and the U.S. is a reluctant participant, but not a leader. And I'll give you an example of that. As you heard in the introduction, I run Shipping Insight, which is the fleet optimization and innovation platform for shipping. And I promised the US Embassy at a recent Greek shipping event that I would bring 6 US tech to participate in the Shark Tank, because we had the Greek ambassador, the US ambassador to Greece, as one of the sharks. It was incredibly difficult because the US is not generating this sort of innovation and technology, the advancements that we do in other sectors. We're not investing in the blue economy. We're not investing in the shipping economy. And it was extremely difficult for me to find 6 technologies, US based, to take to Greece. I hope that changes in 2 years. Shipping can also drive inflationary and other economic pressures. Jim spoke a little bit about the supply chain crisis that drove prices up, supply and demand. But it is difficult to control with no ships or significant commercial presence. In other words, we as the United States, since we don't have ships, we don't have the direct influence on charter rates that one would expect in the largest trading nation in the world. Next slide, please. Then there's energy security. The US is the largest producer and consumer of oil and gas, particularly gas. But there are no US flag LNG carriers. All of them are done on foreign flag ships. Foreign flag ships carry almost all of the commercial oil and gas in or out of the United States. The US energy companies generate over $500 billion, but have divested most of their fleets, their tankers. I will tell you a story. My former late father-in-law was president of Conoco Shipping. The first thing he did when he got to Conoco was to change the names of the ship, because they were all Conoco Star, Conoco Polar, Conoco this, and it was right after the Amico Cadiz. So he wanted to make sure that the company name wasn't on the bow. I think all of you will probably remember the Exxon Valdez of 1989, which was an enormous disaster up in Alaska. There are about 800 tankers above 10,000 deadweight tons that are now registered in the dark fleet, with shadow flag states in the dark fleet to avoid sanctions and increasing risks of incidents, such as that ship-to-ship transfer I spoke of. Almost all drill ships and heavy lift ships are foreign flagged. The first US flag offshore wind installation vessel is still under construction, but it should be delivered shortly for Dominion. And there are dozens of dual LNG and methanol fuel ships being built, but very few US flag. One of the things that I'm particularly excited about is advanced nuclear energy emerging for carbon-free ships. Now, this is an area where the US should lead. We are the nuclear leaders, or historically have been. But China's already announced that they're building a nuclear-powered 24,000 TEU container vessel. Korea has already announced that they're going to be building nuclear-powered vessels. Where's the US? We're losing our leadership, and that's regrettable. Next slide.
So I'll jump in on food security. We called out food security in addition to energy security, just because it is a very significant thing for Americans. We think that we're food security independent, and we probably could be, but the fact is that your groceries are largely a mixture of U.S. produced food and foreign produced food, to the tune of the U.S. Imports $190 billion of food annually. Now, we export $180 billion of our agricultural products, which is a good thing. what is striking is that our exports, which are largely dry bulk goods, agricultural products, we only have 4 ships that are U.S. flag ships to do that trade. And that's really not nearly enough to even provide tonnage for the Department of Agriculture and the USAID to deliver, you know, food aid in critical areas of the world. There's actually, almost 13,000 of these bulk ships in the world, and so we're highly dependent on these foreign flag ships for our critical agricultural product exports and imports. Now, some of the food that you eat is refrigerated. And there's actually, quite a fleet owned by large international corporations with foreign mariners and flagged in mostly these open registries that move those refrigerated foods that we eat every day. They have plenty of refrigerated containers. But if we were to have to depend on US ships, we only have 22,000 refrigerated containers, and that would not go very far for our daily needs here in this country. 50% of the food that's consumed in the US is transported by maritime. So just like any other consumable or product that you would buy at the store, the retail level, sometimes these foods are moved back and forth in order for them to be grown in one country and processed in another and then brought back again. So shipping is critical in that process, and we've found through our research that a significant amount of food is actually spoiled between that production and consumption due to the inefficiencies and the disruption of the maritime supply chain. And we think that if we had a little bit more focus on that as a nation, we could dramatically reduce the amount of spoiled food that we consume. USAID, as I mentioned, uses grain from American farmers, and it totals about 1.8 million tons per year, which sounds like a lot, but it actually doesn't measure up in a comparative way to what the Russians disrupted in their war with Ukraine, and what they were able to also use to leverage their economy using many more dry bulk ships than we have to get their grain out and win over countries that were desperate for grain during that crisis. And then finally, we did mention cybersecurity, and the food industry is definitely one of those industries where cyber criminals or even state actors in the cyber world have been attacking through ransomware, causing shutdowns, and in fact causing over $27 million in ransom payments. And we feel like with such a large portion of our food security dependent on ships, that makes those ships definitely a target along with the entire food industry. Next slide.
Let's take a look at climate security. That's a hot topic, no pun intended. The Defense Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks said, climate change is a national security issue. That declaration is not controversial. It's fact. The consumers have climate expectations. They expect companies governments to be paying attention to climate change and its impacts on consumers. And climate change is driving maritime business and technology. As I mentioned earlier, we as an industry have set a target of net zero by 2050, and we've got benchmarks in between. So we are really paying attention to climate change and its impacts and moving forward on that. And what's happening out of this is there's a fourth industrial revolution going on, and maritime innovation is very much a part of that. Next slide. But there are a lot of opportunities here that we hope that the United States doesn't miss. There's a need for transparency of greenhouse gas emissions for compliance and consumer vetting. The U.S. maritime use of green financing and carbon credit markets remains largely untapped. There are digital tools that could be deployed to increase efficiency, like weather routing, equipment monitoring, satellite communications, cybersecurity. But as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. lags behind Europe and Asia. The developing of future fuels, we're talking about methanol, hydrogen, fuel cells, ammonia, battery, nuclear. The US lags other countries. And as I mentioned, China's already announced the 24,000 TEU nuclear-powered container ship. The US port infrastructure alignment with the fourth industrial revolution ships, the US lags in terms of efficiency. The highest ranking US port at 44 is Wilmington, North Carolina, with the top ports, our nation's top ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and New York, ranking 336, 346, and 348, respectively. Think about that. New York ranks 348th in the world in terms of efficiency. The US, we are leaders in global maritime standards and setting them and worldwide enforcement. Our port state control is extraordinary, but we're behind in implementation. The US blue economy, entrepreneurship, and monetization, we are so far behind other nations in terms of investment, in terms of deployment. And if we want to look at areas of vulnerability, we are an Arctic nation. US and Canada have Arctic coast assets, ports, sea lanes, but very few icebreakers, and lag Russia significantly. Next slide.
Okay, we want to sort of wind up talking about our workforce and the security concerns that we have for our maritime workforce. Overall, there's a workforce concern in maritime. There's a prediction that the world will be about 96,000 seafarers short by 2026. And that's because we have a decreasing workforce worldwide and an increasing fleet size due to our ever increasing consumption of commodities and finished goods around the world. About 800,000 seafarers will need to be upskilled by the mid of the next decade, and that's because of all the changing technologies. We do expect to see new fuels. We do expect to even see nuclear ships by then. Huge amount of upskilling will be needed, and we'll have to attract the best and brightest seafarers in the world to this industry. But back again to where the US stands in all of this, and a former administrator of the US Maritime Administration, Admiral Busby, counted up how many were there on his watch was less than 12,000 qualified, unlimited tonnage and horsepower US mariners. We think the numbers have even gone down since then. So it's time to think about how we might invigorate that career. Next slide.
So as Doc just mentioned, Jim just mentioned, we've got the official count and those numbers have fallen. Less than 10% of U.S. mariners are involved in that international commercial shipping component of our U.S. flagged fleet. And there's an estimated 13% of U.S. mariner positions remaining unfilled, which results in 28% of all U.S. flag sailings are under the certificate of inspection levels. In other words, they're sailing short crew. Career merchant mariners are essential for U.S. maritime security. So if you know anybody who wants to get into the maritime industry, please encourage them to pursue that as a career. Next slide. So all ahead full, our book has a number of recommendations, and here are some of them. One of the things we call out repeatedly is no shipping, no shopping. Americans must recognize the criticality of ships and call for an expanded U.S. merchant marine. Force projection includes the U.S. merchant marine. We need to build dual-use merchant ships and their associated merchant mariner career paths. We need to follow the money. Internationally trading U.S. flagged ships will help stabilize trade routes, protect U.S. imports and exports, and reassure friendly trading partners, i.e. our allies. All is necessary to maintain the U.S. economy as we know it. Don't choke, though. Marine technology opportunities are there for the U.S. We need to embrace climate change, the next industrial revolution, and blue economy now. And we keep saying, build it and they will come. Future U.S. mariners just need to know there's a future merchant marine. Next slide. So shipping in our world is at the heart of maritime security. And I hope after this presentation, you believe it's in yours as well. Next slide.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you to the Institute for inviting us. As I said at the beginning, we feel passionately that maritime is at the center of our nation's strength, but if it's not strong, then it's also at the center of our nation's vulnerabilities. We hope that you will look for our book, 0.4. It's available on Amazon. And if you have any questions now or later, please don't hesitate. We are here to help you learn more about what we feel passionately about. There are 6 authors. We come from different parts of the maritime world, and some are not of the maritime world. But all of us are committed to protecting the United States and our nation and our globe through maritime security.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'd like to thank Ms. Carleen Walker and Rear Admiral James Watson and everyone who joined. For those interested in learning more about our courses and applying to study at IWP, please feel free to visit us online at iwp.edu. One final announcement I'd like to make, the Institute of World Politics 2024 Gala event will be hosted on Wednesday, October 9th at the Library of Congress. Sponsorship and attendance information are currently available at iwp.edu/gala. We hope to see you all there, and thank you so much for joining us online today.